Pastor Joel Waldman.
What's up, STS Nation? Having a weird glitch here on Monday. Welcome back from the long weekend, everybody. The COE and or Space Coast just got us going live after my buttons failed to do so. But welcome to another episode of Surviving the Survivor, the podcast that promises to bring you the very best guests in all of true crime. Usually we are tripled or quadrupled up. Today we have two fine guests. A third may or may not be joining at the bottom of the hour, but we'll keep you posted. It's been nearly 3 years. It's hard to believe after the fatal shooting of cinematographer Halyna Hutchins on the New Mexico film set of Rust. And Alec Baldwin set to stand trial beginning tomorrow. Tomorrow is jury selection. Today there was a stream with some pretrial motions. We are actually not going to be streaming the trial. We are just going to be doing shows on the trial nightly. So that's where we stand. A bunch of us have a little bit of burnout after the Karen Reed trial, amongst other things going on. So we're not going to be streaming the trial date today. But we, as I said, we will have shows. Alec Baldwin, of course, is charged with involuntary manslaughter for his role in this deadly incident that also, of course, injured the film's director, guy with a great name, Joel Souza. Jury selection, as I mentioned, set to start tomorrow. We welcome, for the first time, Ron Rychlak. He is a distinguished university professor and Jamie L. Whitten Chair in Law and Government at the University of Mississippi. He's been on the law school faculty there since 1987. In 2019, he received the university's highest research and publication recognition, the Distinguished Research and Creative Achievement Award, based on his reputation for scholarly activity and leadership roles in professional societies. Ron, you have some really, you're also involved with the athletics department. In what capacity? Ole Miss is no joke when it comes to athletics. What do you do?
It's a pretty serious thing here, Joel. Thank you for your introduction. There's a position called faculty athletic representative that's mandated by the NCAA. So on every NCAA campus, there's one faculty member who kind of keeps one foot in athletics. And I get to do that here. And it's been a fascinating 17 years now I've been doing that.
Wow. And you're also involved with the Vatican in some capacity. How so?
I serve as legal advisor to the Holy See, is the official name of the country, if you will, and legal advisor to them at the United Nations.
Josh Ritter, bringing your credentials right up behind this.
Don't let me follow that. I have not had an audience with the Pope, if you want to know.
Yeah, Ron is directly connected to the Pope, and we're not. So there you go. But Josh Ritter, he is no slouch. He's the 2015 Outstanding Prosecutor of the Year by the Association of Deputy District Attorneys. He now is a partner in the firm El Dabe Ritter Trial Lawyers, and he hosts the podcast Courtroom Confidential, which is gaining steam quickly. Don't miss Courtroom Confidential with Josh Ritter. And we may or may not be joined at the half-hour mark by Morgietta Derizier, who is an attorney that was joining us on the Karen Reed trial, who's been quite insightful. It seems like there's a bit of a July 4th hangover today. People are filing in slowly here. Today is a day to certainly get your questions in there if you have them for Alec Baldwin. And there were, again, some pretrial motions. I'm going to get the best guest take on that in a second. Just a reminder, or letting you know for the first time, I should say, Carm, the COE, myself, and the kiddos, we will be at I'm seeing some troll in the chat already on a Monday. I have no patience, Josh Ritter, on a Monday for trolls. So we will be in Chicago next week, all of us, the entire family. So come see us either July 16th at the Bookseller in Chicago, but we've just added another date here. This is July 18th. We have been invited to Temple Am Shalom, which is actually in Glencoe, Illinois, which is the suburbs of Chicago. So if you're closer to suburban Chicago, that we will be at Shalom on Monday night, and on Thursday night, and look forward to seeing you all there. And as Shaquille Oatmeal says so astutely here, put that triple Q in front of your questions so Joel can see them. That helps a lot. Obviously, the real victims here, Josh Ritter and Ron, is Halyna Hutchins, the cinematographer who's no longer with us because of this deadly, what appears to be horrific error on the set back in 2021. Director Joel Souza was injured as well. An interesting little factoid I discovered in doing some research today. Josh Ritter, you will appreciate this. There's a prosecutor named Morrissey, and there's another defendant in this case who was convicted named Reed, with the name Reed. So we got a Morrissey and Reed in this case, just as we had in the Karen Reed trial. So really cannot escape Karen Reed at all. But just a, let's start. Ron, I mean, I know you've been following this. I know you couldn't see most of the pretrial motions, but that won't keep us from asking you about them today. Just your macro perspective. Does this appear to be an overreaching prosecution here by the state of New Mexico?
My initial thought was that was not overreaching, because from the beginning, my viewpoint has been, when you're at the bottom, if you're the person who pulled the trigger and you expect people up above you to take care of things, you've sort of got a defense. If you're the if you're the producer and you've got people beneath you, you kind of say, well, I put things in place. Well, Alec is in both of those situations. So I've been thinking all along that the prosecution could prevent him from pointing one way or the other. Today was a pretty significant win, therefore, for Alec, in that the court ruled that evidence of his status as producer will not be admissible in this trial. And that means he can be the role of the actor who probably, certainly I think if you're defending him, it was a very horrific accidental discharge that took place. And he had reason to trust people above him to have not left him in that dangerous situation.
Josh Ritter from Jersey Girl, love that, being my home state. But do they really need loaded guns on movie sets this day and age? I think that's part of the issue, is people didn't realize there was a live round in there. But Josh, just when you heard that the state of New Mexico was bringing charges, and they were dropped for a time, we'll go through this timeline of events, and then he was re-indicted with another grand jury. But what do you think of this as a former prosecutor of the year? I personally had a run-in with Alec Baldwin when I was a reporter at Fox 5 in New York, and I can't say I love the guy, but I don't know that he deserves to be. We exchanged some pleasantries. Let's put it that way. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't have enough legal experience, but my common sense tells me is I don't think the guy was doing this with any malicious intent. I know the charges don't suggest that either. But what do you think?
No, I agree with you, because I think at first glance, your first reaction to it is, what a horrible accident. You're absolutely right. There's no one is claiming that he had any sort of malicious intent or that he was at all trying to harm her in any kind of way. So what are you left with? You're left with a really awful accident. And that's how everyone first reacted to it. I think the first questions that people started to have were obviously, well, how in the world did a live round end up on set? But no one was jumping to the idea that, oh, Alec Baldwin is at fault for that live round being on set, or that Alec Baldwin should have known better than to be handling the gun in the way that he was. At the end of the day, he's an actor, and he's an actor on a set. And when he's being handed this weapon, and I make this point because I know a lot of people have been making the comments of, you should always consider a weapon to be dangerous. And that's absolutely true. And you always hear the statement made that you should never point a weapon at anything that you're not willing to destroy. Absolutely. But when you're being handed a weapon on a set, that's a prop. And this wasn't a prop gun in the sense that it couldn't fire a projectile, but to him, it's a prop. It is something to be acted with in that scene. And part of that scene involved him pulling it and pointing it in a certain direction. And that direction happened to involve where other people who were working on that movie were seated. And so I do think it's overreaching for the prosecution to then say, well, in spite of all of that, in spite of the circumstances, and in spite of the fact that he was handed a gun that, there may be testimony that he was told it was a cold gun or a safe gun, that he should be held to a different or higher standard. Now, Ron made a really interesting point that, well, wait a minute, if he's a producer, doesn't he have a higher standard? Isn't he supposed to know about safety protocols? Isn't he supposed to be a little bit more involved than simply an actor at the bottom of this chain of responsibility should be? And you're right, maybe there's an argument to shoehorn in there from the prosecution that he did have more responsibility than a simple actor. But as Ron pointed out, that all went away today. Now, I don't think that completely ends the prosecution's case, but it certainly causes some major problems for them and difficulties for them. I think they have much more of an uphill battle here in trying to argue that he somehow should have known better than the way that he was behaving. I personally, just to get back to your question, did feel it was overreaching in to bring charges, criminal charges. Civil, sure, go ahead and sue if you want to, but criminal charges to me were not appropriate against Baldwin in this case.
And that is coming from a former prosecutor of the year in LA. But Ron, I mean, the proverbial train has left the station here. The trial is set to begin tomorrow, and now the state finds out, well, they can't bring any of this producer role into evidence. How do they have to, like behind the scenes right now, what do they have to do to reevaluate the case that they were planning to bring versus what they can bring now?
I mean, I do think the prosecution got a lot tougher today after that holding. If I'm the prosecution right now, I'm trying to think, because I don't believe that an actor, I agree with what Josh said. If an actor's got a gun that he thinks is a prop, is an empty, and he's pulling out, he's practicing, whether he intentionally pulled the trigger or not, there's been a lot of talk about that. I'm not even sure how important that is. It's either reckless or it's not to do this. And if you have people who are in charge who tell you that this is safe, and in fact, the person right above who's most in charge for that was actually convicted and serving 18 months in incarceration, or at least has been, I don't know if she's serving yet, but she's been sentenced to that. It seems to me the defense has a really strong argument that it wasn't his responsibility. They identified the person who did the wrong thing, and that person is being punished. And Alec, on top of being hard to pin him down for something, he's got the reality of celebrity going with him. He did Hunt for Red October, one of the all-time great movies. So,
I mean, Josh, what about this? Seamus Donahue, Kerry Morrissey, that's the prosecutor, easily convicted Hannah Gutierrez. Baldwin is toast. She's the best attorney in New Mexico. That might be the case, but she's got, I guess, a difficult hand dealt to her. What does it mean with this win today for the defense that they can't mention, his role as a producer? I mean, they simply, in a court of law, what does that mean? That they just cannot bring that up in any regard. They just have to speak from his position as an actor. They can never refer to him as a producer. Is that what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I think they planned on bringing in the idea that he's a producer. What does that involve? What responsibilities does a producer have? In particular, does that involve being, safety protocols and making sure that those are all followed? All of that kind of stuff. I imagine they were probably going to call witnesses just to testify to those aspects, and they're not going to be able to do any of that. Now, the judge has allowed for videos where we see Baldwin handling the gun on prior occasions in a very cavalier manner. And, he's using it to almost direct a scene. He's asking if they can go again, quickly in between takes, and they could point out how that is not exactly following safety protocols. But as far as what that would mean in his responsibilities as a producer on the film, they're not allowed to get into, which again, I don't think it completely, undercuts their entire case, but that was, I believe, a strong reason why they decided to bring these charges against him in the first place. That, to that point, that the comment that we saw earlier about how they convicted Hannah Gutierrez Reed, that was a very different case. That was a very different prosecution. I think the nexus between her conduct and the death of Halyna Hutchins is far more direct, because she's responsible for the safety of those weapons. She's responsible. Her whole job is to make sure that there are no live rounds that end up in guns. And if she fails in that, there's a direct connection between that failure and Halyna Hutchins' death. Whereas Baldwin, he's at the end of people who should have been making those checks. And now he's being handed a gun and being told to perform in a scene. And without that kind of larger role as a producer, I think it becomes far more difficult for them to prove, because so we're all clear, that's what they have to prove, is that under the circumstances, he should have known that his conduct was likely to lead to the harm or death of others. Under the circumstances of an actor being handed a prop gun on set, and again, I know the gun was functioning, but as far as he's concerned, that's a prop for the purposes of what he's being handed it. When
That's
being handed it,
I mean, that's a great point. I got to be honest, as a non-lawyer and a movie watcher, I am a movie watcher. I kind of just shook my head when I got this news originally. It just didn't really, exactly to Josh's point, like the armor, that is the job. But for Alec Baldwin, the analogy, I guess, could be made that on news, the anchor is the quote unquote talking head, and it's the producers doing the real work behind the scenes. At least that's what I was always accused of just being a dumb talking head, which is partially true, but I just don't see how you can censure Alec Baldwin for this kind of mistake. But I guess the state of New Mexico thinks otherwise. Josh talked about what the jury would need, and there's a legal term, Ron, which is willful disregard. To convict Alec Baldwin, the jury must find that he acted with quote unquote willful disregard for safety. That is, he knew what he was doing was dangerous and did it anyway. But to Josh's point, again, he's acting in a role. He's given this gun, which are used all the time in movies. We're said to be too violent movie culture. And there was this horrific accident. But how was he to know? By the way, he says he didn't pull the trigger, which is a whole other issue, which we'll get into. But how could it be that he knew what he was doing was dangerous and did it anyway? That's what the jurors would have to believe.
Yeah, well, I think it's really hard. A lot of states refer to that as recklessness, where you're aware of the risk and you do it anyway. I think showing that he was aware of the risk in this case is going to be really hard, because if he was, like Josh said, he was handed a prop. He didn't believe it was dangerous. There's film of him practicing. He's trying to slip it out of his jacket, and sort of they're filming that. I think it's gonna be very hard to make the case once you've eliminated that evidence of him being a producer. When the producer was in, then, and especially being on set and some of the direction, the film clips that Josh referenced, you put those things together, I think you've got a case. You kick that out, what happened today, it's a much harder case.
Yeah. Tennis Girl 101, I'm conflicted. No intent, but he knew the gun was real and it was pointed at someone, regardless of what he thought about ammo, followed by Abby Crossing. Tennis Girl, big friend of the show, as is Abby Crossing. I'm seeing Lindsay Shea. Henchy Held coming to us from Jerusalem, Black Widow and the Republic of Ireland, lest you think we are not an international, global phenomenon that we are. Abby Crossing, he never should have done that interview with George Stephanopoulos. You mean this interview? Let's watch a clip. The COE comes with receipts.
After lunch, we rehearsed.
Wrong one. That's the police.
You're never supposed to point a gun at anyone on a set, no matter what.
Unless the person is the cinematographer who's directing me where to point the gun for her camera angle.
Let me just stop it there. I'll replay it. So this is George Stephanopoulos. He did this interview. I don't know how else to say this. Alec Baldwin just doesn't look like a sweetheart of a guy. He looks like a kind of guy that's his reputation follows him, and it does. He was a total you-know-what to many of us reporters. But here you go. We're going to take it back from the top, but he's indignant here.
Point a gun at anyone on a set, no matter what.
Unless the person is the cinematographer who's directing me where to point the gun for her camera angle. That's exactly what happened. That day, I did exactly what I've done every day on that movie.
Which is what?
Which is that there's an armorer there, and that word is new to me. In the years I've been in this
What did
business,
you call it?
It was a prop guy or woman. And the prop person would come, and sometimes they would insist on demonstrating for you and the camera crew. They take the gun, if it was a contemporary gun, they show you the chamber, they show you the clip, they'd say, the gun is cold. And you look at it and go, thank you. And in the 40 years...
Sometimes that would happen, not all the time.
Well, but no, sometimes they wouldn't demonstrate to me. Some insisted on demonstrating. They would do the demonstration for everybody there right before we rolled the camera, or rehearsed. Then there were others who they didn't do that because I trusted them to do the job. Believe me, I would do anything in my power. I would do anything in my power to undo what was done. I don't know how that bullet arrived in that gun, I don't know. But I'm all for doing anything that will take us to a place where this is less likely to happen again.
Look at this, right on cue. Morgietta has joined us for that.
There are some who say you're never...
Do you believe him there? He would have done anything for there not to have been a live bullet for this accident to happen. What do you make of that clip you just watched with he and George Stephanopoulos?
Yeah, I don't know who his PR team is, but if I was on that team, I would not recommend doing that interview at all. It looked like a cross-examination. I don't know. From where I'm sitting, it definitely looked like he was on the hot seat there. And sometimes there's no right or wrong way to give an answer. It's how you say it. I mean, it looked like he was given some kind of emotion there. But remember, from a legal perspective, this is technically a recorded statement that potentially could be used against him. He's talking about the case. He's talking about the facts of the case. And sometimes it really comes down to intent, especially when you're being charged with involuntary manslaughter. And what is a jury going to take from this interview? Can they see whether or not he unintentionally did it? Can they read through that and see his emotion or not? I would have never crossed that path and had a statement lingering out there that someone could use to interpret against me if I know that I have an impeding trial coming up in the very near future. So I can't say if I believe him or not. I'm kind of just shocked that he actually went through and did this interview.
Yeah, Josh Ritter, they say that lawyers make terrible witnesses, but maybe the only person worse would be a A-list Hollywood celebrity, especially one that's not very likable. I think most people agree on this. He's a fantastic, an unbelievable actor, probably one of the best of his generation, but known to not be the nicest guy. And he's really indignant. Just curious by the way, you're in LA, Ritter. So what did you think watching this clip with George Stephanopoulos, and will this be played in the trial, do you think?
I agree with Morgietta. I imagine his attorneys were just pulling their hair out to try to get him to stop from doing this interview. But you're probably right. He had a PR team in his ear saying, oh no, we need to get out in front of this. And you need to make a statement on this, because they're concerned about his public image and his attorneys are concerned about whether or not he ends up behind bars. And they probably should have listened to the attorneys, because I think this is going to cause problems for him, because more than anything else, it has cornered him into one very specific narrative as to what took place. He emphatically said he never pulled the trigger. Now they can't do anything but say that. Now the defense can't pivot and they can't react to what the prosecution may bring up in their case. Instead, they have to stick to this idea that he never pulled the trigger. I think what it demonstrates probably more than anything is that he's an actor, and he has, like he said, for the last 40 years, made a living on just put me in front of a microphone and put the camera on me, and I'm going to take care of this whole problem. And he probably thought he'll do this interview and the whole thing will go away because he can explain himself. But instead, I do think that these statements will somehow haunt him in this trial, especially so if he decides to go ahead and take the stand, because then he cannot change what he has said before. They will play this statement, or they will impeach him with this statement if he decides to somehow change even in a slight way, what happened with that gun. And we know that they've done significant testing along with the FBI to determine there's no way that gun could have fired without the trigger being pulled. So now what is he? Is he a liar? Is he misremembering? You know, all of it doesn't look good for him. And I don't know if it even really scored him the PR points he was hoping for in the first place.
Yeah. Morgietta, I know you came on late, so just so you know, you're talking to Josh Ritter, former prosecutor of the year, criminal defense attorney in California, and Ron Rychlak, who is a professor emeritus, I think it is. Is that right? No,
Ooh.
Not emeritus, but a distinguished professor.
Thank you.
Distinguished professor at Ole Miss. So he's a law professor, just so you know who we're talking with. Ron, I mean, to Josh's point, this clip that we just watched, I have another one, I believe, but do you think the jurors are going to watch this if they did not see it themselves already?
And there's a decent shot it'll come in. I will say, in response to what Josh said, I can't imagine his team, Alec's team, pivoting to where they're going to say, yeah, I intentionally pulled the trigger. So I think being locked into having said I didn't intend to do it, I don't think is quite a big of a problem. I think that I think he probably did pull it, by the testing suggesting he must have. I think he probably didn't intentionally pull it. He cocked the gun, and when it's cocked, it doesn't take much pressure at all. The mere pulling it out could well provide enough pressure to have it discharge, and that's probably what happened. So I'm not sure. The discussion about intentionally or not pulling the trigger, I mean, I guess if he intentionally pulled it, yeah, we could much more easy to get conviction. I think the fact that he said he didn't intentionally pull it will be what he will stay with, even if they say that it must have been pulled. I think it'll say, well, I didn't mean to. I pulled it out maybe accidentally. I think that's consistent, really. I don't think that's a deadly problem with this interview.
Yeah. By the way, for those who have not followed this closely, and I know a lot of you have not, and I, for full disclosure, did not see the first trial because we were covering a different trial, but Alec Baldwin was rehearsing with a prop gun for a scene back on October 21st, 2021, at the Bonanza Creek Ranch in Santa Fe County, New Mexico. That's when the gun went off. It killed Halyna Hutchins, the cinematographer. It wounded the director, Joel Souza. They were setting up a shot where the actor, being Alec Baldwin, was supposed to draw the gun and point it at the camera while standing next to the camera. And the cinematographer, this Halyna Hutchins, who has since passed as a result of this, she was guiding Alec Baldwin on where to point the gun. And he said that the gun, this is according to Alec Baldwin, direct quote, the gun was not meant to be fired in that angle. He went on to say, I didn't pull the trigger. The gun was supposed to be empty. So two different things there. I didn't pull the trigger, but also additionally that the gun was supposed to be empty. Morgietta, Alice Ryder-Feld, is an attorney in Miami, friend of the show. She writes, like an attorney. Do you think he would have pointed it at his own head and pulled the trigger? Yeah, me neither. He would have had them show him, just not tell him. Very interesting argument. Is this an argument that the state of New Mexico will bring up during the trial, especially if he takes the stand?
Yeah, and and with coupling this with the interview that we just saw, right? He made a statement that said that he's been doing this for about 40 years and very often, and he caught himself too, because the question was every time, or something to that effect, where he literally admitted in this interview that not every time does somebody come in and demonstrate this to him. That window of opportunity was left there in that interview clip that we just saw, that not every single time it happens. And so the question is, whose responsibility is that? Is that yours? Like, because you're holding the gun, does that something that falls into your lap? Are you now allowed to place the blame on somebody else if a demonstration didn't happen before you utilize this prop? And so, it leaves the door open to suggestion, which you don't really want in a criminal case. You want the facts to be cut and dry. And if he does take the stand, he is essentially bound by those statements. Obviously, he can change them if he likes, but it's going to make it really difficult to present an accurate defense, because he's rested on some of these statements, which, as it was stated earlier, was a PR move that may not have gotten him the points that he wanted, right? And so what do you do with that information? It's already out there. It's tainted by the public. People have seen it. You would hope that the jury, veneer that they pick hasn't seen it, which would be very difficult. But how do you encapsulate that, especially if he is going to take the stand? And if he's so bold to do this interview, what would prompt him not to take the stand, right? Because he is feeling that he's innocent. And as someone stated earlier, actors and actresses may feel more vindicated if they have a voice, if they have a mic in front of them. So, if he testifies, he's stuck with these statements that have a little hole in them that the prosecution could go in and really do some damage on cross-examination.
So Josh Ritter, your crystal ball, does Alec Baldwin, by the way, the trial is expected to last 9 days. Do you think we'll see him take the stand? Coupled with this question from Jen DeSimio, will he spend time in jail? I think I have to double check the amount of time. It's like 18 months or so. Yeah, 18 months. Does he spend time in jail, prison, if he is convicted? And does he take the stand, Josh? What do you think?
I think whether or not he takes the stand depends. And I think the crucial thing that it will depend upon is whether or not his defense team is able to get in the directions that were being given to him at the time, because I think those are crucial. He said that in that interview. He was asked, isn't it true you never point a gun at anyone? And his response was, well, unless the cinematographer is telling you, that's where you should point the gun. And to me, that is crucial. To me, that is important, because again, if this is an actor and this is a prop and he's being told, hey, we want you to point the gun directly at the camera, we want to get this really cool angle pointed directly at the camera, well, then, he's listening to other people and he's being told the gun is safe and he's just following direction. I think that's important because his state of mind is important, is at issue. So if his state of mind is, I'm following directions and I believe I have a safe weapon here, then that's that's very important to the defense. So if they're not able to get that out from some other means, then he might need to testify just to that alone, which then these prior interviews might present some problems for him. If he is convicted, I think he will do jail time. I think he will get the 18 months because, if justice is blind, how are you going to give the armorer 18 months and not give the big time Hollywood actor 18 months if he's convicted of the same crime? So I think he's very well looking at jail time if he is convicted for this.
Wow. Alice Reiterfeld here. And listen, I have no doubt that Alec Baldwin feels horrible about this, as does Gutierrez Reed. I mean, Alec Baldwin even suggested he would unalive himself if he thought that he had, done this, intentionally or haphazardly. But he really believes that, there's no blame to attach to him for this, horrible death that occurred. But Alice Reiterfeld, and Ron studies and teaches the law for a living. You guys have to look at the law in New Mexico. He was holding a real gun, not a prop. And in an earlier message in the chat, she said there's no armorer's defense in New Mexico, which I thought Alice was kind of joking about, but I guess she's being serious here. Not to put you on the spot, Ron, but how important is it to look at the law specifically in New Mexico as it pertains to this?
Well, of course, it's usually important because that's where the trial's taking place, and that's where the instructions, the jury will be formed. On the other hand, I think the issue at hand, it will be his mental state, like Josh said, which does a number of things. It makes statements that would otherwise be hearsay admissible. It makes somehow the prosecution is going to have to show to the jury that he knew there was a serious risk and he disregarded it. If he was handed what he believed to be a prop gun, an unloaded gun, and he's just simply following directions, I think it's really hard to take it to the point where he took a reckless situation, created a reckless situation that endangered someone else's life.
KB here, just coming in with a comment, Morgiet. I came here to say that you're responsible for those you hire to ensure the safety of your employees. You know, I guess, Morgietta, where does this like never ending, passing of the baton end here? I mean, is an armor. It was interesting to hear Alec Baldwin describe the armor as as a prop person. He never even heard the word. But to Josh's earlier point, which may have been before you came on, he basically said that the buck really, he thought or believed, stops with the armor. Hannah Goodyear's read. Do you agree with that or no? I mean, does the actor also need to be responsible when handling a weapon on a set? My initial reaction, I would think not. I would just think that you're being handed this gun, you're an actor, and you're just doing your job. What do you make of it, Morgietta?
I would tend to agree where the buck stops with the armor. And I think what they're also going to be looking at is, number one, as Ron said, the state of mind, right? Because we could throw in the, where the buck stops and all that, but we have to look at the person who's actually on trial, and we have to look at the charge that they're being faced and what the prosecution actually has to prove, right? And so one is looking at the intent, and that intent could cover how many times he's had a firearm similar to this. How often does he shoot scenes like this? How often does he check, right? So these are some of the things that they're going to be looking into. But at the same time, it goes to, I think someone said earlier, about how much instruction was he getting, right? So it's these two things coupled together. Is it in the normal course of a scene or a set like this, where someone just hands you a gun and someone else's job is to check to make sure it's a prop or it's not a prop, and you're just supposed to do your job, right? So these two things coupled together is really what's going to be focused on whether or not they can move forward with a guilty verdict for involuntary manslaughter. Is this a normal course? Is this a normal scenario for an actor to be in? And is it normal for Alec Baldwin, right? Because you have to be very specific about this particular case. It's not across the board, right? You have to look at the actual person who is being charged with this crime. And so that's why it's really important, and it'll be interesting to see if he does take the stand, because it looks like there are a couple of statements. I don't know if he made other statements to the press, but it'll be really important to see what his state of mind was and what he understood to be. If there were instances in the past that he knew he was given a loaded firearm and the Commonwealth can prove that, maybe through some other witnesses or things of that nature, he might have a problem, right? And, you got to look at, how much blame do you give to the armorer if it's reasonable for an actor who is similarly situated, or even Alec Baldwin in particular, it's reasonable for him to know that he could have been given a loaded firearm. That's what they're really going to be looking at.
Matthew McMahon, who's a friend of mine and a friend of the show, I understand, Josh Ritter, the absolute need for gun safety. But as an actor, is it any different for Alec to practice using the gun than for him to practice saying lines? Where do you draw that line?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that, in that interview, the point was made about guns and how they should be respected and how you should never point them. And again, to clarify, when I'm referring to this gun as a prop, I know that it was a functioning gun. I know that it was able to fire bullets. But I'm saying that when you're being handed something like that on set, it is a prop for the purposes of why you're using it at that point. They're not at a gun range. They're not out hunting. They're on a movie set, and he's being handed a gun. And that context makes a world of difference. So you're right. He's going to be practicing lines. He's going to be practicing scenes. There's footage that I've seen where he's practicing coming out of that church set several different times, and every single time he's firing the gun off. Now he's firing the gun off camera, but we don't know what he's pointing it at. He's just kind of firing it haphazardly because he's rehearsing, and part of rehearsing involves firing the weapon, at least in that footage that I saw. And in this scene, it sounded like part of what he was rehearsing was the pulling out you know, the removal of that gun from its holster. Now, the testimony that we've heard, or the reporting that we've heard, is that it didn't involve him pulling the trigger. So I think that's why he's made a large point over the fact that he hasn't pulled the trigger. But I think actually the reason why that may have become important at all is the prosecution wanted to make sure that that gun didn't malfunction somehow. I mean, I don't know how they bring a case at all if that gun is just malfunctioning and going off on his hand without him doing anything. So eliminating that gun could not have fired without the trigger being pulled, I think was important to the prosecution. But I agree with Ron that it might not be all that important as far as his criminal liability, because again, his mindset is what's at issue here. And if his mindset is that's a cold gun, that's a prop as far as I'm concerned, and there's nothing dangerous about it, and I'm being directed to rehearse this scene, you know, that the getting around all of that, to Morgieta's point, they're going to have to show that somehow beyond this scene, he was reckless. Was he doing other things at other times that the staff just couldn't control this man? And he was, you know, not listening to anyone's direction as far as safety. And this was just an accident waiting to happen, or a tragedy waiting to happen.
Yeah, well, Jean Philpott here, does he know how the trigger was pulled? That's my question. That's, I guess, the $64,000 question. Alec Baldwin has said he pulled the hammer back as far as he could without actually cocking it, and maintains that he never pulled the trigger. We've got another clip. I think this is the second clip. Let's watch this from the George Stephanopoulos interview.
After lunch, we rehearsed for the camera, and we came back after lunch. We rehearsed for the camera, and I took the gun. I'm showing him. I'm going to go like this, like this, like this. Cock and turn. Bang! It went off. The first time.
He later insisted to ABC's George Stephanopoulos.
Well, I didn't pull the trigger. Someone is responsible for what happened, and I can't say who that is, but I know it's not me.
Man, there's such an arrogance. Always such a. Speaking of cocking the gun,
how do you really feel, Joel?
Yeah,
tell us.
He's just so cocky. Morgieta, I mean, you watch that, and just to the point I was just saying, he says very assuredly, let's put it that way, that he pulls the hammer back as far as he can without cocking it, and that he definitely never pulled the trigger. Are we to believe him?
Again, you know, I hate to beat a dead horse, but this is defense attorney cringe at this point, right? Because now you have a recorded interview, which I'm assuming is at the police station. I couldn't really see too clearly. And then you have a televised or recorded interview with an interviewer, right? And in between those two times, he's talked to his attorney, he's talked to his PR team, he's rehearsed what he's going to say, what questions could he anticipate, and things of that nature, right? That's cringe, right? Because now you have two what appears to be almost conflicting statements that could potentially be used against him. And of course, the second interview, which is he's more polished, his hair is slicked back, you know, they have the camera on and everything is kind of looking shiny and perfect, right? That's going to be a later recorded statement that if someone is going to analyze this closely, they're going to say looks more rehearsed. Again, he's an actor. Whereas the earlier statement is right there, fresh, and happened right after this alleged incident, right? So are you going to believe that interview more or less because it was closer in time? And again, it goes back to the state of mind, right? If you're looking at state of mind and looking at these two interviews, the later one, you had more time to decompress. You had more time to think about your statements and what are you going to say and what's the purpose of this statement. It's to gain, more, coverage with the fans or the press or whatever the case may be. Whereas the earlier one, it's an interrogation or an interview. Again, can't really say where it is, but it looks like it's something that's going to be used against you in the future as part of the criminal investigation. So still don't know if I believe him, but what I would say is the earlier one is definitely closer in time. So it is more believable because you would assume that somebody at that particular time is going to lean closer towards giving true information because it's fresh in their mind. You know, it's something that just happened, and that is a state of mind that can be analyzed as well.
A couple interesting questions here from Rosemary Romero. Is the defense still using the argument that Alec Baldwin didn't pull the trigger? I believe so, because the gun was considered faulty or defective. Then there's another interesting question from her, Ron, to a bigger point. Is the defense trying to blame Halyna Hutchins for directing Alec Baldwin? This is something that can be, it's a great point, because even Alec Baldwin suggests in a roundabout way, he doesn't say it's her fault, but he says she was directing me. How careful do they need to be to not blame the person who was killed in this horrible accident, Ron?
Well, you don't want to alienate the jury by saying that the victim was at fault. On the other hand, that was the director, and he's got to explain why he was pointing the gun where he's pointing the gun. And if she's telling him, point it here, point it at the camera, I'm here at the camera, then they were both lined up. They're both of the victims in the case. That's his reasoning. That's his explanation. I think he has to do that. It's not really blaming. It's saying they told me to point here, and and then the first part where he says he didn't pull the trigger. I think that will morph into he didn't intentionally pull the trigger, because seems like it's impossible for the gun to have gone off without it having been pulled. And if it's cocked, and really when he's telling the police station, I thought he said I cocked it, then it went off, but maybe he said I didn't cock it. But it only takes like 2 pounds of pressure if it's cocked. It takes very little. So you might not consciously even realize you're pulling the trigger. When you pull it out, if it's cocked, there's a good chance it's going to go off just from that motion. And I think that's actually a reasonable likelihood of what might have happened there.
2022 testing of the .45 caliber Colt prop revolver, Josh Ritter, showed that the gun would not have gone off without the trigger having been pulled. He insists he didn't pull it, but the testing of the gun shows otherwise. This is obviously something that the state is going to bring up. I mean, how critical a piece of evidence is this, Josh?
Well, it's critical, I think, only to the extent that it shows that the gun is not malfunctioning, right? Because I think that if there was a problem with that gun and that gun could fire without the trigger being pulled, well, then they really have a difficult case for the prosecution, because then how do you blame someone for a malfunction? That, he's holding a gun, you can't even say he had his finger on the trigger and this gun just went off. That's completely an accident, and I don't think he could be held at fault, and I don't think they would have brought the case. So they had to eliminate that problem to begin with. Now they know that this gun, or they believe they know that this gun could not be fired without his finger being on the trigger and pulling the trigger. So, okay, he goes out and says, I never pulled the trigger. I mean, I think it could come down to he probably didn't realize the amount of pressure that was needed to pull that trigger, especially if it's cocked, all of these other things. But I think what the defense is going to have to do now is, if they're sticking with this idea that he never pulled the trigger, now you've got that the prosecution has tested the gun, and in testing the gun, they damaged the gun. And the defense has described it as destroyed. The prosecution has described it as altered. But in any case, it's not in the condition that it was at the time that it went off. And the defense is now left with saying, well, we weren't able to test it. And you, in your custody, had this weapon, and you destroyed it when you tested it. So we can't have our own expert give a conclusion as to whether or not that gun could have fired without the trigger being pulled. Again, I think this is probably not the most important issue in the case as to far as was the trigger pulled or wasn't it. I think it much more has to do with what should he have known at the time and what should he have done. I think more convincing evidence for the prosecution would be things like Baldwin wouldn't listen to us. We tried to get him to go and do safety rehearsals. He wouldn't do it. We tried to get him to remember to check the gun himself before every take. He wouldn't do it. I don't know if that evidence exists, but I'm saying that would, to me, be far more convincing as to his state of mind at the time that he's rehearsing this scene. because again, it comes down to what is he thinking at that moment. And if he's just kind of a reckless cavalier person with this weapon, and that's why it's important as to far as how he was being directed. If he's deciding for himself, I'm going to go ahead and point this at the camera and at you guys, that might be a cool looking shot. That's one thing. But if he's being told, hey, point it in this direction where we happen to be seated, that's an entirely different thing as far as his state of mind.
That's actually an amazing point, is what was going on. I mean, I guess an obvious point that I didn't think of, but what's going on just prior to this. And Seamus Donahue with a comment that actually plays right into it here. And it seems like Seamus has been following this pretty closely. The moments that led up to the shooting were captured on tape, as you might suspect, since this is a movie. Baldwin was recklessly practicing a cross draw. Morgietta, I mean, to Josh's point, obviously, I would assume, I shouldn't say obviously, the state has this video or film, if you will, and I assume this is going to be shown to the jurors. How crucial is this? What was going on just moments before this deadly accident?
Yeah, this is going to be a really crucial piece, to Josh's point, because part of, again, trying any case, especially a criminal case, you have to look at the jury instructions and you have to look at what the law is. And I'm sure in New Mexico, similar to here in Massachusetts, you have to show wanton disregard or some sort of recklessness that was taking place prior to the incident actually, occurring. Not what happened 6 hours before, although that may be relevant. Not what happened the day before, although that may be relevant. But if you're in the moment and you're being directed to do something and you say, hey, I want to do a different shot, I think it'll look better, or you're not following directions, or you are entangled in emotion and you're being driven by something else, it does call to your state of mind. And if you aren't being cooperative and you are being reckless, that really goes to the heart of what the prosecution has to prove in terms of the elements that are being held against you, right? And so it is a very crucial piece, and jury will have that. Luckily for them, they'll have those few moments, right before the incident occurred, and it's going to be their determination to see whether or not they believe his behavior was reckless or not. Where was he standing? How long was he standing? Was he being combative? Was he listening? Who else was in close proximity to him? Talking about some of the shots that he was firing off, like how did that take place? And so in a very unique way, they have this information that's recorded prior to this incident happening. So it's going to be really crucial.
It's going to be interesting to watch. That is for sure. Nightwood here. Interesting question for Ron. Jury selection begins tomorrow. Today were just some more pretrial motions. It's a trial that's happening in New Mexico out west where I used to live, not New Mexico, but in Arizona. And people like their guns out there. Second Amendment is a big deal. What about this, Ron? Will gun stances or your stance on the Second Amendment matter for jury selection here?
I'm certain that attorneys on both sides are going to spend some time thinking about this, because it's not a clear-cut case the way sometimes gun crimes would be. In a way, in this case, if they determine that, this case could lead to the end of using real guns on movie sets. There's been discussion about that. This case may illustrate the need for better instruction in gun use, and depending on how it comes out that way. There is testimony, of course, not testimony. There's statements that he did not pay attention during the gun instruction course that was given on the movie set. George Clooney talked about how he always personally checks every gun. So there are a lot of gun safety issues tied up in this. It's not immediately apparent to me if I'm an anti-gun person. I suppose that might make me conviction prone, but I'm not 100% sure which way that would cut. I'd want to talk with some more experienced trial attorneys than me to figure out how you'd think about that.
It's a really interesting point, I think. Ida Shaw to Josh Ritter, and she's an attorney, by the way. Doesn't the prosecution have a causation issue with Alec? Is act of the armor loading the gun an intervening event, getting into legal speak here. Josh Ritter, care to take a stab at that about the
Yeah,
gun?
that's we're getting into the weeds with the legal stuff here
Yeah.
with Ada Shaw JD. No surprise that question. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if I call it an intervening event, or if it's more, I mean, to get to that question, and again, trying not to get into the weeds, it would be one thing if he had somehow handled the gun, passed off the gun to someone else, and now it was returned to him. But he is the last in the line of people who are handling this gun. The first person, according to the way it played out in the first trial, is that, it goes from the armorer, and in this case, it went from to the assistant director, and there's some dispute as to whether or not that intervening step should have even happened. But it's going from an armorer whose entire job is to determine that that gun is safe, and then it went to the assistant director, who then told him, and we'll see if this comes out in testimony, that the gun was safe. So it's not so much of a question of an intervening event as much as what responsibility did he have beyond all of that at the time he received the gun. And if they're going to have testimony that doesn't matter if the armorer says it's safe, doesn't matter if the assistant director says it's safe, he has a responsibility independently himself to check that weapon. Okay, that might be a powerful point. But if he's an actor being handed a weapon and everybody else did their job, then he is under the assumption, and I think rightfully so, that that weapon is safe. I mean, one thing that I've said many times on this is, if I'm his defense attorneys, he said he had a 40-year career. I want to find out how many times in his 40-year career has he been handed a gun on set. On this set alone, he had a gun handed to him dozens of times. On how many other films that he's done in a 40-year career has he been handed a gun? And was he ever under the idea that that gun could somehow not be safe in all of those takes that he did with these weapons? And now, in this one time, he's expected to somehow know better than to point the gun where he was directed to point it. That, to me, is the most difficult argument for the prosecution, and I think the strongest point for the defense.
And that's why Ritter gets paid the big bucks. That's a great question. And I'd be asking the same thing. I mean, it's a great question because it has to be probably in the thousands of times. He's been in Westerns, been in all kinds of shoot 'em up movies. Mod Mox Goods here. Another interesting question. Did the script call for pointing the gun towards the camera and pulling the trigger? I don't know the answer to that. And then Jimmy McNutty with a similar comment. Jimmy of Karen Reed fame, convinced of Karen Reed's guilt. The key will be what the setup of the camera was for. I think it was just taking the gun out of the jacket and not pulling any trigger. Morgietta, this would be big. I mean, if the script says, yeah, you're just supposed to pull the gun out, but he was, either goofing around or taking it a step further, that could be a big problem, couldn't it?
Yes. And so again, this goes back to the intent and whether or not it was reckless or not, right? Because reckless comes in many flavors, right? The textbook definition that at least I was given is, if you're driving a vehicle through a playground, you can't assume that you're not going to hit a kid, right? You have to just presume that that's going to happen if you drive your vehicle through a playground. So if the script calls for you to do something specific and you go do something else, and that would be considered reckless, because that wasn't really in the definition of what it is that you were instructed to do, quote unquote, at that particular time. And so it goes also back to what direction he was given from the production team and things of that nature. These are little points that I think the prosecution could hone in on. I'm not sure if it's going to be a dispositive point, whether or not it was in the script or not, because he could have been getting, direction from elsewhere. Again, the jury has the beauty of actually seeing the film, and they can make that determination that even if it wasn't in the script, maybe he was getting direction from somewhere else, or maybe not, right? And so these two things coupled together could, hurt or, help in this particular situation. But specifically being in the script, I don't think that in and of itself would just point directly towards any one of the particular elements. It may just kind of help clarify things.
That's interesting. The charge, by the way, here is involuntary manslaughter. Again, he faces up to 18 months in prison if he is convicted. He also initially had a gun charge that would have brought him 5 additional years, but the firearm enhancement charge was eventually dropped. Julie Frew, who's one of our amazing mods, it's not his first rodeo, not his first producer role, not his first actor role. 6 left the scene due to not safe filming scenes. That is true. People did leave because they were, fearful of that. And then you see this comment here. He was warned Hannah was incompetent and should have fired her as the producer for the movie. But Ron, with this win by the defense today, they can't make this point now, right?
It's going to be a lot harder. Those last 2 comments I agreed with completely until today. But the ruling today that they're going to focus on him as actor, not as producer, not allow evidence of his role as producer, was an enormous win for the defense. The defense did have a loss today. There was a state report, the state OSHA, that had in essence put the blame on the armorer, and the defense wanted to put that in, and the court ruled that inadmissible. So it wasn't an entire win, but I think it was a huge victory for Alec Baldwin's team today to get the producer stuff kicked out of it.
Yeah, and Josh, what would open the door for the state to be able to, you attorneys like to slip things in that you're not supposed to. So what would open the door for the state to be able to make that case that he knew as a producer? Shout out to Nikki Cuds for the gifting 5 memberships. But yeah, again, what would open the door in a trial like this for the state to say, hey, even though we're not supposed to mention it, by the way, he was a producer and he had concerns or was told that there were concerns about this armor?
Great question. I'm sitting here trying to think. I can't think, if they're careful enough, I can't think of any obvious kind of landmines unless he takes the stand. And if he takes the stand and can't help himself, which it sounds like he's got a little bit of trouble doing that, and says something like, I didn't know any better, or I was doing the best that I could, given the circumstances, or I'm just trying to, think of some way that he could somehow try to distance himself from responsibility on that set. And they could say, what do you mean you didn't know better? Or what do you mean you didn't know about the other safety concerns on set? Or what do you mean you didn't know about safety protocols? Or you didn't know about the qualifications or lack thereof of the armorer? Weren't you in fact a producer on the set? And that, I think, could easily open the door to all of that if he tries to get a little too cute in his testimony. But without, short of him testifying, it might be difficult.
Yeah. This is a great question. If any of you know the answer, I don't. I am not a gun guy, but I do live in Florida. What's the difference in pulling the hammer back and cocking the gun? I thought they were one and the same. I actually thought that as well. Ron, do you happen to know? I'm only calling on you because
I live in Mississippi.
Yeah. I was going to say you're older and wiser than us. So
my understanding would be you can pull it back before it cocks. So you pull it back far enough it cocks. That's what I thought he said he pulled it back, it cocked, and it went off. I cocked it and went off, or something like that. You somewhere maybe said somewhere else he didn't pull it back far enough to cock. But that could be, if you pull it back almost all the way and let it go, that also, I think, in some guns could result in firing.
There's your answer, I guess. Tennis Girl 101 to Morgietta. How helpful is it to the defense that the gun was destroyed by the FBI during testing? To Josh's point earlier, they can say, hey, we couldn't have our own experts test this because the FBI destroyed it.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting if there are any, motions in limine or motions that come out during the testimony, because they're going to need a firearm expert to testify, right? You can't establish that fact without that particular without that particular expert. So it would be really interesting if the defense objects in any way or raises an objection during that testimony to the fact that they weren't able to actually use their own independent expert to qualify or disqualify some of that information. I would presume at this point, though, this particular issue would have been litigated. The fact that the evidence has been quote unquote destroyed by this FBI personnel, because I would be hard pressed to believe that they're on the eve of trial, eve of jury selection, and this particular issue hasn't been addressed yet. So if it hasn't been, I'm sure during the testimony of this expert or some sort of motion in limine may be inputted at that particular time to address that particular issue with the jury.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, please do, Josh.
They actually did bring this up. I think it was last week or the week before. The defense made a motion to dismiss the whole case based upon that issue, saying you destroyed evidence. We need to, based upon that, you should drop the case. The judge obviously didn't entertain that, but the judge found, and I thought it was interesting, that because it wasn't considered exculpatory evidence to begin with, because before they had destroyed it, they had tested it and found out that it couldn't be fired without the trigger being pulled. So it wasn't quote unquote exculpatory evidence that they had lost the ability to test themselves. But the judge did say in that ruling that it would be a fertile ground for cross-examination. And I'm sure they're going to try to make as much of a point about that as they possibly can.
Josh, speaking of this, and yeah, it was, by the way, they did try to get it tossed. I think it was a week ago. They said that, I guess the testing, the way the gun was presented prejudiced the grand jury and failure, they said, to allege a criminal offense. These were some of the arguments, I guess, that the defense was making in trying to get the case dismissed altogether, which failed. But Josh, one of the other issues that came up, the defense for Alec Baldwin asked the judge to block talk of the 1993 incident on the Crow set. That was Bruce Lee's son, Brandon Lee. He died. I remember that. I don't want to say like it was yesterday, but I remember wondering back at the time, how could someone die on a movie set, and thinking it was so weird because Bruce Lee died at such a young age. The state aimed to reference, by bringing up the Crow, they aimed to reference Alec Baldwin's knowledge of the dangers of using blanks. That wasn't even a live round. I'm not sure where this stands now, but I don't think they're allowed to bring up the movie, or maybe, I actually don't know. Are you aware of which way?
Yeah, my understanding was the judge said that that's not going to come in. The idea that that tragedy on the Crow set, but again, you can see where the prosecution was trying. I think the judge made the right call, by the way, but you can see where the prosecution is trying to go with this. They desperately need to show that he understood this was a dangerous situation, regardless of if that's even blanks that are inside of that gun. They're going to try to make the argument, blanks or not, you never point a gun at anyone and pull the trigger, and therefore he should have known, and therefore he should be found responsible here. And I think that, I mean, we're talking about an event that took place decades ago. There's they can't really prove whether or not he was even aware of that. But I think even in spite of all of that, some tragic accident forever ago does not change the circumstances of what he was aware of at the time. And if he was aware at the time, he's being told this gun is safe, and then he's being directed on where to point the gun. Those are two big problems the prosecution's going to have to handle somehow.
Copper Horse, a mod from New Jersey, I might add. A gun could fire if the hammer is pulled far back and released, even if not fully cocked. Morgietta, we're taking some heat, I see in the chat, that we don't have the prosecutor's perspective. Everyone here thinks that we're defending the defense. But if you are the prosecutor in this case, if you're the state of New Mexico, What are you going to tell the jurors in your opening statements? What's going to be some of the things that you say to them?
I would definitely focus on, you have to focus on his state of mind in your opening. You have to point in the fact that he has been doing this for 40 years, that he should have known better. That has to be the focal point, that he knew that the firearm, although being used as a prop, was a real firearm, and that it was in his possession. And while it was in his possession, he recklessly and without any specific direction, if they can put those facts in, pointed it at an individual, pulled the trigger or pulled the fire enough that it could have gone off, and that he knew it could have gone off. And as an experienced actor, he should have known better. And he had the intent, to have this reckless behavior happen. And he didn't do anything to prevent that from happening. These are, I would say, those are some of the key points you want to get in to your opening, that this wasn't, not necessarily that it was a mistake, but that there are facts in there that show that it was reckless behavior, and it wasn't just him being directed by other personnel for him to actually, just point it here, and he was just doing as he was told and raising up his hands, that he has some culpability. These are some of the things that you would really want to hone in on an opening statement.
Josh Ritter, anything you'd like to add as no pressure, former prosecutor of the year? You're up there representing the state of New Mexico. What are you going to say to the jurors in your opening statement?
I think all of those points were excellent. I would add that he had a cavalier attitude on set, and that there's video footage of him using the gun as if he's trying to direct people with it. And there's footage of him asking to do a take quickly on the heels of a first take without having safety protocols handled. In fact, in those hearings that they had last week, the prosecution is going to introduce evidence that he was distracted and on FaceTime phone calls with family members and not paying attention to what's happening on set. And I think you have to the jurors, as the prosecution, show this kind of mounting tragedy waiting to happen, that he was cavalier, he was not paying attention, he was not concerned with the safety of others, and he's this, maybe try to lean into his ego as a big time actor. And this is what happens, folks. This is what happens when you don't pay attention to the small details. This is what happens when you don't care, when you're cavalier with dangerous things like weapons on set.
Ritter,
Guilty.
Ritter, I love it. I love it. The real LA is coming out. Rosemary Romero, we'll toss this one to Ron, and then we'll start to wrap it up. We made it through the first Monday back after the fourth. Could Alec Baldwin, could his past lawsuits, this is Josh is making fun of me. I do think he is a, I don't know. He's people call him a bully. He's a character. Yeah. He's a belligerent man sometimes. Could Alec Baldwin, could his past lawsuits, I think the lawyer in me knows the answer, even though I'm not a lawyer, is no. But with assault, can they go to anything in his past history to say, look, he's a hothead, he's temperamental, he did this, this, and this, and so therefore he probably acted, arrogantly and flippantly on the set. But can they bring in any of this stuff from the past?
They cannot use it for that purpose. But if he takes the stand, it could conceivably come in for his credibility, which is another reason why I don't think there's any way in the world he will take the stand.
Interesting point. Thank you so much to Morgietta Derzier. Did I get it right, Morgietta?
Got it right.
There we go. She is a native Boston, currently resides in the South Shore. She was with us for the Karen Reed trial. The big question on the thumbnail, is a conviction coming? What do you think, Morgietta? Your final thoughts?
Just on the Alec Baldwin or the Karen Reed? Just making sure.
We're staying away from Karen Reed today, but just on Alec Baldwin.
To be honest with you, it's hard to say, but it really depends on if they can really paint this picture that the buck doesn't start with the armorer, and that he really had more of an involvement in knowing that this was a loaded firearm and that he was being reckless in his behavior. I also don't think if he takes the stand, it's going to be harder. If he takes a stand, I think it's easier for them to get a conviction. There's so much there that the prosecution can go with. If he doesn't take the stand, it's going to be really interesting because you have to show recklessness. You need a lot of pieces to move to that point. So I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure.
Morgietta, by the way, since we do have you, and there was some big news on the Karen Reed front today, did you see the news?
I did, and yes.
What do you make of that? I've seen some people say it's a PR stunt. Others say let him get sworn affidavits. Is this going to be a game changer?
So I definitely don't think it's a PR stunt, only because they did have one actual juror who came forward. There was 2 other jurors who came through third parties, but you had that one that actually reached out to David Yannetti, unprovoked, coerced, and just, which is really unusual. Sometimes if you get a not guilty verdict, you'll hear, you did a great job, I loved your cross, and things of that nature. But when you have a hung jury, in my experience, it's a little unusual for the jurors, unprompted and unprovoked, to go to the defense side. And I think what'll be really interesting is what Judge Cannoni does. I think at this point, she has to at least do some sort of voir dire, whether it's closed camera or not, about what the jurors thought, or what the deliberation was. Because the real question that comes into play is, was there coercion? Did they feel like they were forced? They're making some really bold allegations that at a minimum on count 1 and count 3, that they were unanimous on that front, right? And there wasn't, a per se question to them, are you hung on all 3 counts? It's just, are you hung, right? And so it brings us to a very unique area of law that, of course, the defense attorneys are going to raise, and it'll be interesting to see what the Commonwealth's response is going to be. But
it was my understanding the whole time that they had to make a decision on the first count before weighing the lesser included, but I guess that's not the case. I don't know.
No, and I think the other thing is too, they were also calling into question whether or not they understood the verdict slip. If there was some confusion with that. The whole case, as I said before, is so unique in and of itself. It just, day after day after day, just something new comes up. But the piece that the defense attorney is raising is a huge piece. I mean, if it is in fact true that they did more or less have a unanimous vote on 1 and 3, you could have this issue of double jeopardy attaching. That's what they're going after, right? That's the whole point of this whole motion is, can they even retry her on count 1 and count 3? And that's a huge piece.
T-Sue's woohoo courtroom confidential. We'll see how that plays out, Morgietta. Ron Rychlak, he's a distinguished university professor at Ole Miss. He is the Jamie L. Whitten Chair in Law and Government. Sounds very, very fancy. He also is involved with the athletics department and the Pope, of all people and things. But Ron, thank you for being a first-time best guest. We hope that you will come back. Ida Shaw, this is our community. She said, one last question, please. And this is the question. Is it a good defense that he is rusty? Ida, that was weak. Even Ron, the Ole Miss professor, shaking his head. But Ron, the big question, is a conviction coming? What do you think here with this trial?
Until today, until the judge ruled that the producer information is not relevant, I thought a conviction was quite likely. If the prosecution cannot get that information in, and there's some stuff, while Josh was talking, that I was thinking there were some points where it might become relevant. We're talking about a cavalier attitude, and if the defense puts on evidence that says, well, that's not his role, there are times when evidence might come in, even if he doesn't take the stand, that could feed into that. But I think that if I'm the defense, all efforts are to make sure we don't make his status as anything above actor relevant in any way. Try to make sure we just stay with him as an actor. And if he were not a producer, if this were a normal movie, he's an actor, he's given a gun by someone who's in charge, the person says, it's cold, or it's not dangerous, it's empty, I don't think we'd be here. I think we're here because of the additional associated responsibilities that the grand jury heard about when they indicted him, and the fact that those issues technically are not relevant now, means that the conviction's quite unlikely.
There you go. Hearing it from the college professor. Josh Ritter, he was named the 2015 Outstanding Prosecutor of the Year in Los Angeles. He's now a partner in the firm El Dabe Ritter Trial Lawyers. And most importantly, he hosts the podcast Courtroom Confidential. He's not just a pretty face. He's a smart attorney. Janice here says Baldwin is still guilty. Anyone holding a gun, regardless of what position, is responsible for their actions. He's an adult and should know that. Josh, is this going to be a trial or a case where you think, or do you think, where the jurors are going to come in sort of with a firm opinion, like Janice has, ahead of hearing the evidence, just because of their stance on, how they feel gun safety should be dealt with?
I think that the prosecution and the defense are going to have a real tough time trying to find people who don't have some sort of strong feelings on guns, and they're going to have to really make sure that they voir dire on that heavily, because that could become a very important issue, whether or not people just have a problem with guns to begin with, and that they should never be pointed at anyone under any circumstances. I don't care if you've been directed to or not. But I will say, I think this case is an absolute tragedy. Halyna Hutchins sounds like she was a really nice lady. Everybody who talks about her has incredibly nice things to say about her. And it's a tragedy that she lost her life and to her family, but that beyond a reasonable doubt is a really high standard. And you have a case where I think everyone's initial reaction to this is it's an accident and it's horrible and that no one wanted this to happen. And isn't that awful? And you've got an actor who thinks that he's just rehearsing a scene and this horrible, horrible thing happens. And to try to find somebody guilty of a crime beyond a reasonable doubt under those circumstances, I think it's going to be very difficult for the prosecution. And can I do a shameless plug, Joel?
Yes. While you do yours, I'll do mine. I'm going to be at this bookstore on July 8th, not bookstore, the synagogue, July 18th. Shalom. It's in Glencoe, Illinois. If you're near the suburbs of Chicago, it is open to one and all. Go ahead, Josh. Didn't mean to one up your promo.
Please, coming out tomorrow, I did a whole deep dive video on Baldwin, on all of these kind of issues. And if you haven't subscribed already, please check out Courtroom Confidential on YouTube. And like I said, tomorrow I'm going to be releasing a video. I'm very proud of it. I did a lot of work, a lot of research on Baldwin and all of the issues that we've been talking about tonight. So please, everybody, check it out tomorrow.
We're going to get Josh back on to break that down. Tomorrow is jury selection in this case. Another amazing panel here today. We're going to be doing shows on this trial. Again, it's expected to last 9 days, I believe, once the jurors are picked. So it'll go into next week and possibly the following week, and we'll get these guests back on. Ron, I hope you will come back on. And Morgietta, it was amazing to have you, and we'll get you back on for your Karen Reed take as well. We'll give that a little rest for now. Glad everybody is back after a very happy 4th of July. It just makes me think of one thing. When I was living in LA, I remember going to lunch with a guy who does, of course, special effects. I can't think of the name of the company, but they're like one of the most widely used special effects company in Los Angeles, in Hollywood. And he was telling me that 95% of the outdoor scenes that we see now in all kinds of TV shows, sitcoms, even in movies, it's all done using, CGI. And just leads me to wonder why in 2024, after this tragedy with the Crow, why are we using real guns on sets? They could do everything else. They could fake us out with everything else. I think the technology is where it needs to be to use fake guns, even sound effects, things of that nature. And the person watching the movie or the TV show will still buy it as though it is real. That is my 2 cents before we say goodbye. For now, love you, America. Love you, Mississippi. Love you, Boston. Love you, Los Angeles. We will be back tomorrow night with another show at 7 p.m. Eastern. Thank you, guests. Guests, stick around for 1 second.